We've covered many protests in our careers as photojournalists. We were like, whoa, this is definitely something different.
Hello everyone, Miles Ezilo here, back with another episode of the Monumental Project. Last month we gave you guys a special interview with Mayor Stoney on the situation in Richmond, Virginia. Definitely give that a listen when you can. Today we'll be opening up that story even more by taking a real look at what happened in Richmond, Virginia 2 years ago. While there are countless examples of controversial monuments around the country, very few have garnered the attention that Richmond has created with Monument Avenue, a 14-block long tree-lined residential boulevard cutting across central Richmond. The reason for its controversy? Well, for over 100 years, the street was riddled with Confederate monuments. Jefferson Davis, Stonewall Jackson, Matthew Fontaine, J.E.B Stuart, and of course Robert E. Lee would stand tall looking down on the citizens of Richmond with no realistic removal plan in sight. All that drastically changed when George Floyd and Breonna Taylor passed away. After days of heated protests, by July of 2020, many of the monuments were torn down and removed. To many, this seems like an open and shut case of activism doing its part, but a deeper look reveals more to the story than people think. Today, the Monumental Project sits down with Richmond historian Lexi Cleveland, photojournalist Regina Boone, and Richmond-based entrepreneur Devon Henry on their experiences during the downfall of Monument Avenue. This is the Richmond story. Let's dive in. As one of the oldest cities in America, Richmond owns the title as the state capital of Virginia. From its inception, Richmond has always been a historically relevant city. At the St. John's Church in 1775, American founding father Patrick Henry famously uttered the words, "Give me liberty or give me death," sparking the Revolutionary War. After bouncing back from the war and becoming a thriving manufacturing city, things changed in 1861. The state legislature resolved to secede from the United States and join the newly formed Confederate States of America on April 17th, 5 days after the Confederate attack on Fort Sumter. Official action was taken in May after the Confederacy committed to relocating its provisional national capital from Montgomery, Alabama to Richmond. To speak on the history of Richmond and how it relates to Monument Avenue, we spoke to Richmond native and historian Lexi Cleveland. Lexi is the executive vice president at ArtGlass, a software technology company based in Richmond, Virginia, and Milan, Italy. As a public historian who focuses on early American history and interactive programming, Cleveland received her BA in history from the College of William and Mary and her MA in American Studies from Leiden University in the Netherlands. Cleveland has participated in innovative projects interpreting the lives of enslaved Virginians at Colonial Williamsburg, George Washington's Mount Vernon, James Monroe's Highland, and most recently on Richmond's Monument Avenue. To hop into the questions about a little bit of the history, as a former capital of the Confederacy, how did the city of Richmond transition out of the Civil War?
Well, for Richmond, of course, Reconstruction was a very complicated time. Richmond had to rebuild itself in both literal and metaphorical terms. A lot of buildings were destroyed. The economy, which was, focused around slavery, was wrecked. The social order had been torn apart. So it was a lot of time of uncertainty, but it was also a time of a lot of possibility to build something new.
Right.
And the Black folks in Richmond really seized upon their new freedom. So they immediately went about educating themselves, voting, starting their own institutions and businesses. And some people even became politicians on the local and federal level. So this time of Reconstruction and renewal definitely gave Black people kind of an opportunity to start a new life after having been under, the institution of slavery for so long. But kind of this rise of Black prominence and Black progress also led to a lot of tensions with the white folks in town, because in some ways it kind of hurt their perceptions of themselves to see these people who had just recently been enslaved now, becoming regular functioning citizens, which previously they were arguing they could not do.
Right.
So it's a time of progress, but it's also a time of a lot of tension.
Interesting. If you could briefly speak on Monument Avenue specifically and its relationship with Richmond history. I was doing, a little bit of digging and found that the creation of the Robert E. Lee statue was an effort to deter an alliance of white working class Democrats and Black Republicans. Is that right?
Yeah, so I assume by that you're probably talking about the Readjuster Party.
Right, exactly.
So the Readjusters were a biracial group of politicians that collaborated on causes such as funding public schooling for everybody. which was a really popular cause because that's something that, both white parents and black parents can get behind, is giving their children education. At the time, Virginia had been very heavily in pre-Civil War debt.
Mm-hmm.
And the readjusters essentially argued that instead of immediately paying down all of that debt, that they wanted to readjust, so, like refinance that debt so that they can instead take that money and spend it towards public schooling. So
Right.
that's kind of, how they get their name. And I'd say the way that they're kind of linked to the monuments is that the prominent powers, the aristocratic class here, was very threatened by this, biracial coalition of like, poor whites and black folks, because the party was very dominant in the early 1880s.
Mm-hmm.
And so they kind of turned poor whites against the readjusters and against, the black people in that party by really fomenting racial strife. And part of the way they did that is through the erection of monuments, kind of mythologizing the lost cause, trying to create this false sense of a shared history as to why they should be siding with them as opposed to the black people who they actually have things in common with. And you can definitely see that also, kind of just in the creation of Monument Avenue in general. And it's kind of sad and a little ironic because when they create Monument Avenue, not only do they exclude black people of all classes, but they also exclude poor white people. So they're essentially kind of playing a team sport that they're not even really invited to join in that sense.
That's so interesting, man. So when doing your research with Monument Avenue for the walking tour, which is also a great history tour of Richmond, coincidentally, what piece of history surprised you the most? Like what kind of things, kind of like this, for good or bad reasons, kind of gave you some pause? Like, wow, I didn't know about that.
I think for me, probably the thing that shocked me the most was just the profit motive angle behind Monument Avenue. So even if you're looking at the Lee Monument, at the time it was installed, this is outside of city limits. It's like literally in the middle of nowhere. So even for people at the time who really want this monument, they're like, wow, this seems like a kind of a grab of public money to fund a public real estate development. So even people at the time were really kind of skeptical and weirded out by that. And even as you're going through newspapers, looking at all the advertisements for the neighborhood, for the real estate development, there's just something very jarring about seeing it essentially given all the gravity of essentially like a neighborhood on a golf course when you know that these monuments are really about white supremacy. So I think just kind of the contrast between the profit motive and what these statues really mean, like it's still something I'm kind of wrapping my head around today.
I guess as a final question, would you say that the history of these monuments are overlooked? Is it kind of an underlying thing within the community that people know about, or do most people just kind of walk over it and not really know the full meaning of it? As a Richmond native, like what would you say?
I would say that it probably kind of depends on your race.
Interesting.
So for black people, we've always known that these things are oppressive. It's like, why would we want a giant statue to Robert E. Lee?
Right.
For a lot of white people in town, they were just like, oh, well, it's just history, or, oh, well, maybe his cause was bad, but at the end of the day, he was a great general. So I don't think until 2020, we were probably having enough discussions around it. Like black people kind of always inherently knew. For white folks, they didn't quite see it the same way we did until like quite recently.
However, things came to a head in 2020. Set off by the murders of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor, Richmond citizens took to the streets to voice their concerns over police brutality as well as the symbols of hate that have been present for years. These protests continued for over 2 months. So what was it really like on the ground while all this was happening? To get a better understanding, we spoke to Regina Boone. Regina Boone is a photojournalist and fellow Richmond native. She covered the Monument Avenue protest 2 years ago, and her work has been shared around the world from Times Magazine to NPR. She currently has an exhibit at the Branch Museum titled Reframing Protest, Design and Hope. Hello, Miss Regina. How you doing today?
Good. How are you?
I'm good. I can't complain. Thank you for being a part of the Monumental Project. It means a lot.
Thank you for having me. I'm so grateful for the invitation and just love how Verse has been working with all of this. I'm a photojournalist, telling the stories of people of my community, of Black Richmond, Black and Brown Richmond, and even white Richmond, and Asian American Richmond, and the Latino community, and the Native American community. So our paper, although we consider ourselves the Black press and we are people primarily focusing on the Black community, we are a paper that is for all people. We are inclusive. We are telling the stories to right wrongs and to share slices of life that oftentimes are overlooked in daily newspapers or organizations that are white majority run. Wow. So I don't know any other way but to read a newspaper, but to go to a paper to find a trusted source to tell your story. And I understand the power of the Black press.
Wow, that's powerful. So it's always been with you. So this has always been a natural kind of thing. As a Richmond native, what was your personal experience with Monument Avenue? I can imagine this was something you probably knew about from a pretty young age, right?
Yeah, so let me back up a little bit. Yeah, I was born here in Richmond, but I left when I was 7. And so I primarily grew up in Baltimore. And then my parents moved back here the year I finished college to start the Richmond Free. Then this became my home, where I come back to. And then it's been my consistent home now for the past 4 years. But you are right. I was born, I was raised knowing the story of Monument Avenue. And in our household, my father called this the Avenue of Losers. Wow. And we knew my father also referred to these horrible people, these horrible statues, these horrible monuments as roadblocks, intentional roadblocks, but definitely as the avenue of losers. He never minced his words. He always told us how evil these people were, and why would anyone want to celebrate being a loser?
Wow.
And so why would a group of people pay money to put these monstrosities up when they represented nothing but losing?
Yeah, of course.
And always instilled in us, my brother and me, and anyone who worked for my father, with my father, always knew this narrative. And, he always was calling for these statues, these losers, to come down, always.
So let's fast forward to 2020. A couple of years ago, you were a prominent factor in showing the George Floyd protests in Richmond through your photojournalism. If you could walk me through your experience at those protests, the energy on the ground, and what kind of effect all of that has on the work that you do.
Yeah. So yeah, that was, it's 2 years ago. But in some ways it feels like it was a million years ago. And then in other ways it feels like it was just yesterday. And I still feel like I'm recovering from intense PTSD from being on the streets for more than 65 days consecutively with my colleague Sandra Sellers, covering everything that unfolded on the streets of Richmond following the heinous murder of George Floyd, and the ripple effect across America and across the world. Now, here in Richmond, the intensity was, of course, sparked as it was across the nation and the world, as I just said, the murder of George Floyd. But then the protests here took on many, as they did in many cities, but here in Richmond, it started to be focused on Monument Avenue with George Floyd, with other people who were wrongfully, unjustly murdered by police, to the local narrative of taking the statues down, to also addressing police issues and defunding the police and mental health issues as it related to a young man named Marcus David Peters, who was murdered by a police officer in a mental health situation here in Richmond.
Right.
So there were so many things that were like brewing here. It was like, just as it was everywhere, it was like, it was the perfect storm, right? And it became this huge hurricane, tornado, tsunami, all put together. And yes, my colleague and I were on the streets for this. And we remember, we were just talking about this today. We remember we knew that there was going to be this gathering at a park, and we got out there that first evening, and it was just like thousands of people. And we've covered many protests in our careers as photojournalists. And, we were like, whoa, this was like, we were like, this is definitely something different. And we knew we knew our role as photojournalists, that we had to be there as much as possible to document as many minutes of this revolution that was happening before our eyes. And so the energy became really intense. Sometimes it became scary. Sometimes it became so inspiring, because as the days went by, what we started to notice was community that was being formed. And although we were, our jobs as photojournalists is to document everything that we see, right? Which we did. But then you also start seeing more than just the mainstream through line of the narrative that was unfolding in front of us. What we said was community forming, and the way that community was forming through the artists that were on the ground, and how artists were using their talents to formulate a message, to fight for justice, to right wrongs, to voice their opinions. So we started seeing singers, dancers, photographers, painters, spoken word artists, ballerinas, Black and brown ballerinas, even just the everyday person who may not have even considered themselves an artist, but they did grab a magic marker, they grabbed a piece of cardboard, and they sat with intention and wrote words down, voicing what was making them angry. But they took time with it, so they printed it in a certain way. And we call that art too. So we started seeing this on the streets. And so as we were photographing all of the confrontations between police and the people, and people screaming and yelling at each other, we also found the beautiful, quiet moments that demonstrated the true message of the protests, and what the people wanted. And the people wanted, and still want, change, and for everyone to be recognized, to be treated equally, to be treated fairly, for the laws to reflect that, for the system to reflect that. And so all of this that I'm saying is what we were in the midst of. And the energy was intense, but we understood our jobs as photojournalists. We understood who we never, also, I want to make it clear that never disassociated ourselves from who we are as human beings, as Black women. Black women with a camera, that's a powerful tool.
Yes, it is.
And we knew that. And we knew that the majority of imagery that people see across the world are most often seen through the eyes of a white man. And so we knew that we were in a very particularly unique position, working for the Black press, working for local community, Black-owned, a locally community Black-owned paper, and being two women consistently on the street. We knew we had an important role and an important job, and we could not let our community down, and we could not let the future down. Because if
Wow.
we weren't there to lock in these moments from our eyes, from our perspective, and print them, archive them, and then show them in a show, an exhibit, which we were never thinking about an exhibit, of course, when we were on the streets, but in our heads, we were understanding like this was history and
Mm.
who we were as Black with a camera. We understood the tool we had and have.
Wow.
So it was intense. It makes me like, I kind of get chills even when I talk about it. Um,
I mean, I have chills just hearing you talk about it. So I'm sure it must have been such an interesting energy, like you said, a mixture of so much. Wow. That's amazing.
yeah. I mean, pain,
Mm.
trauma, happiness. I oftentimes had to put my camera down sometimes and just take a breath.
Mm.
Sometimes had to just sit on the curb and just collect my thoughts, sometimes break down, sometimes, I mean, because it was so intense.
This leads us to Devon Henry of Team Henry Enterprises. After the decision was made to actually take down these monuments, someone had to take on the responsibility of making it happen. Many contractors in the area avoided the project altogether, afraid of the inevitable backlash the takedown would create. Devon Henry, on the other hand, rose to the occasion. So to start, can you please give like a brief introduction to yourself and the work that you do?
Yeah, well, my name is Devon Henry. I am a contractor based in Richmond, Virginia. General contractor in the sense that we build, renovate, design, build all types of uh, properties from higher ed, buildings, classrooms, to healthcare, hospitals, clinics, cancer centers. But what's really been our latest claim to fame has been, two different things. One, we actually built a monument, which was a memorial to enslaved laborers at the
Mm.
campus of University of Virginia, and then most recently the actually taking down of monuments here in the former capital of the Confederacy in Richmond, Virginia.
Right, right. Such a wide scope of projects. I didn't know that. I'm assuming you're talking about the monuments on, Monument Avenue, right?
Yeah, that's where most of them were.
Right, right. What was your personal experience with Monument Avenue? Growing up in Richmond. After speaking to a lot of people, Richmond native or not, there's a surprising level of variance in the opinions on what you get from people's firsthand accounts of the monuments on the street. So, what was your opinions of the monuments as you were growing up, or as you were, around the city?
That's a very interesting question. I actually grew up in Newport News, Virginia,
Mm.
and I've lived in Richmond for close to 20 years now.
Right.
But um, you don't really have a good perspective on what especially from a classroom perspective of what the Civil War was really about and what the Confederate generals really stood for,
Mm.
and just what the narrative has been, for centuries around what is and what was and the reason for the Civil War. I mean, in
Right.
fact, I went to Robert E. Lee Elementary School,
Wow.
so had no idea just what was behind the name. And
Mhm.
so as you fast forward to living here in Richmond, you and as you become a little bit more ingrained in the history of what's happened here in Richmond, you start looking at things a little differently. And so I would ride down Monument Avenue, and I see these statues, and I just keep on moving, right?
Right.
But if I could, I would be on Broad Street, the street over, versus coming down Monument. So I had there was it was almost like I had to come down Monument Avenue,
Mhm.
in order to go down there. It wasn't by choice, if you will.
Right.
Um, and so when I see the statues over years, you start hearing more about, um, you know, what was the history? When were they put up? Right? Who were they put up by? And when you start learning more about that, and you start, you know, getting more ingrained in your history, and not just the history books in which the classroom taught you, or taught by, you start learning like, damn, those things are not supposed to be up,
Mm,
and these generals are not supposed to be um, decorated and celebrated in the public eye.
right, right. Yeah, I think you're not alone in that company of people who came up around those names and figures. You talked about Robert E. Lee, elementary school. Like that's a case for a lot of people, especially growing up in the South. It's almost like around you so often that you don't even notice these names and the history behind them.
Right.
Really interesting stuff. So, if you could walk me through the process of ultimately taking down the monuments on Monument Avenue, when you received the call or sent the proposal, what kind of emotions were running through your head, and how did it all play out?
Yeah, well, Miles, that's an interesting story there. But the root of it is that I got a call from the governor's chief of staff, who at the time the governor was the Honorable Ralph Northam,
Right.
and his chief of staff was Mr. Clark Mercer. He called me after he said numerous calls to other larger contractors, trying to get them to, because this was at the height of the George Floyd, protest that was
Hmm.
happening in the streets, and folks in Richmond was not having it. I mean,
Right.
they were throughout the streets. They wanted change, and you know, at that time, it had been so many folks for decades trying to get these statues to come down, right? And I felt like the administration saw an opportunity that they really needed to do something, and they needed to do something meaningful. And when the call came in, he said, "Hey, Devon, we want to take down the Robert E. Lee statue." I was like, "Oh, okay," and we want you to do it. And I said, "Whoa, uh, wow." And as I gathered myself and trying to understand the moment and what was happening, I immediately said, "Hey, okay, let me run it by our team. Let me give you a call back." Right.
Right.
So, it's not just a normal project. So I had to talk to my team, make them aware of, hey, we're thinking about taking on this controversial project. And then I also had to talk to my family and say, hey,
Mm.
hey, kids, wife, we're planning on doing a project, and I wanted to talk to you about it. And the thing that was interesting, that my kids would say, well, Dad, you never talk to us about any other project, like what's happening here. And I just told them, this is a project that has been very controversial, has been a lot of energy around it, negative and positive, depending on
Mhm.
what side you're on, and that Daddy may be in the middle of something that can be a potential um, dangerous situation.
Right.
And we just talked through it, um, and my team and everyone kind of shared with me some of the things that they had been reading, right, and some of the
Hmm.
things they had heard or Googled, and you start looking at the things that happened in New Orleans, right, where the contractor who they selected got his car blown up, right, and then you start looking at what happened in Charlottesville, where that Unite the Right rally, which was a deadly rally, was all centered around Confederate statues.
Right.
Um, and ultimately, it came down to a decision that if we didn't do this today, I think those statues would still be up
Mm.
today. Because if not us, then who?
Right.
And they had made it very clear that they had reached out to every contractor in the Mid Atlantic, or at least specifically in Virginia, and no one was willing to do it. And
Mm.
so we stepped up.
In that same vein, your website says that Team Henry has done governmental and federal projects before. um but how much different was this job in particular from a logistics standpoint? Were there different hoops that you had to jump through because you had so many eyes on you, or was this just, a run-of-the-mill kind of project for you once you got past all of the fanfare, so to speak?
Oh, Miles, this was nothing that resembles a normal project, right? I
Mhm.
mean, the application of it, right? Rigging, crane work, bringing it down in a safe manner. That's every day, right? But
Right.
the the safety concerns, right?
Mhm.
The law enforcement that needs to be involved, right? The logistics of where are you going to take this thing? How are you going to get it on a truck on a and where are you going to take it and what's the best route to do it? So it was more about the logistics, more about the safety than any of the application of the process,
Right.
that made this just so much more of a different project. Not to mention, you got millions of people across the country, looking at this, right? This is
Mhm.
not just, there were thousands of people in the street when we first took down Stonewall Jackson in Richmond, but there were live broadcasts across the country that, there's just a level of scrutiny that's attached to it that you have to be 100% on,
Mm.
not just from the safety of the application of the work you're doing, but for the safety of potential folks wanting to bring bodily harm to those that are taking down the statues.
Whew. Yeah.
But all these folks said we would never get work anymore in the area. They said we will be out of business in less than a year. They really threatened the livelihood of our company. And Miles, I tell you what's interesting. We've never been more busy today.
Wow.
Today, right? It's amazing how just things have worked out in that regard.
Wow. That's great. Things usually do work out when you do the right thing, right? I'm glad that
I
you're
like
a
to
part of
think
it.
that.
Yeah. And make sure to add US ICOMOS and the Monuments Toolkit to that good group. We support you 100%.
I appreciate that, brother. I
No
appreciate that.
worries. So where does this leave us? While the spotlight is still on Monument Avenue for many Richmond citizens, for others, the right idea is to leave Monument Avenue free of statues. Aside from the recently built Arthur Ashe Monument on the same road, having an empty street is a solid reminder of what happened and what should be avoided altogether. To others, the right decision is to fill the streets once again with pieces of art, but this time with commemorative pieces, championing the culture and diversity of the city. Others are on the fence. As the story continues to unfold, we can only hope that the final outcome does something that the original monuments failed to do: make the citizens of Richmond feel safe, at home, and proud of their city. Thanks again for listening to the Monumental Project. How do you feel about the situation in Richmond? Please reach out with your opinions at monumental@usicomos.org. We would love to hear from you. Join us next month as we speak to yet another incredible leader in the historic preservation movement. You won't want to miss it. As always, I'm Miles Esilo. We'll talk soon.